Today we are going to explore the topic political economy of trade with a panel of experts from the region's leading trading partners. Now, can you even, I don't know how long ago you picked this topic, but it doesn't seem like it could be more timely. The politics of trade, and the panel will address the current trade environment, strategic trade policies, economic implications of globalization, also the challenges that this presents on a global stage and here in the St. Louis area. So joining me on stage right now is the Belgian ambassador to the United States, Dirk Wouters. Thank you. Also, Caroline Vicini, who is the ambassador and deputy head of delegation for the European Union to the United States. And also Martin Caro, who is Trade and Investment Commissioner of ProMexico, or Mexico, right? ProMexico. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with Ambassador Wouters, but of course I would love for all of you to feel free to chime in if there is something that you would like to add. Because one of the goals that we really hope to accomplish today was to get a better understanding of the current trade landscape and the politics involved, because this has become maybe more political than many of us remember being in recent times. So my first question, Ambassador, is why have the words globalization and trade suddenly become bad words? Oh, I think you're mic'd. You should be good.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Debbie. Let me first make one remark, and I think I'm also speaking on behalf of Caroline and Martin, and that is I would like to express words of sympathy for all the victims of Hurricane Florence. I mean, I know that there are many people here in this community that still remember the damage that floods can do also to a city like St. Louis. I think it was 93. So, words of sympathy. To your question, why has it become so contentious? For example, free trade, and why has it caught the public attention? I think there are different factors. I like to mention first technology, especially automation and digitization. I think that plays a role. But trade or free trade is often the default reaction. And there are more people that criticize trade than technology. I mean, I don't know about you, Debbie, but I never hear criticizing the iPhone of the people. Maybe you criticize your iPhone. I don't criticize my iPhone.
So when it doesn't work right.
Yeah. But it's a default reaction. But there are, of course, other factors. I think that, of course, the development the last 30 years of the global supply chains, which many business people are very familiar, has kind of allowed to take decisions in the allocation of resources of one company, a global company, to invest elsewhere. An example is when you take a decision to invest in Mexico automobiles instead of another, and then of course it may have some effects. Also, there is a question of pace in today's world. We heard in the interventions a lot of developments for the Metro St. Louis and Missouri community, and I was thinking, well, this is going really fast in your reach out to the rest of the world. And the pace can be a problem when you try to kind of oversee internationally with rules that keep up with new developments like e-commerce and other developments in trade. So that's also a factor. And then I would also like to mention, I mean, and we see in Europe, not just in the United States, there is this, politicians have a bit changed their view on free trade. I mean, and that's also a factor when I hear that all free trade agreements of the past are not good anymore. Then, of course, it tells you something about the conviction on free trade. But there is this, especially in Europe. I mean, I left Europe in 2016. And it was a bad year for Europe, a horrible year. And I felt, and I was discussing it with the mayor at the table, that a lot of the criticism against globalization and everything that went wrong came at the same time with the huge expectation that public authorities and local communities and cities and states would give more security and protection, and security in the widest sense of the word, also economic security, back to the people. And that's what I think you're all trying to do, achieve here, and I have to compliment you with your acting local, thinking global approach. Thank you.
Anything either of you would like to add about why those words have become bad words?
Yeah. First of all, hi everyone. I'm representing the European Union, and I think I just want to situate this in the context we have here, because in Europe, as you know, we are 28 member states. Our last member state is Croatia, that joined in 2013, and we form a single market. So there is a free flow of goods, of financial resources, money, services, and it allows people to go and live wherever they want and work wherever they want within these 28 states. We also negotiate trade agreements for all the 28. That's the Commission's prerogative to do that. Just so to understand from where I come. And of course, this is also an issue that the European Union has dealt with and is dealing with on a daily basis. How can we convince people that globalization is good, and how can we convince people that free trade is good? And I very much agree with what Dirk, Ambassador Wouters said, that I think the development is too fast for people, really, to be able to feel comfortable. We moved forward already earlier. I mean, during my whole lifetime, things have moved forward, but not at the speed we see now. And it always, when I meet these tech people, it always kind of scares me when they say, you know, it's never going to go as slow as it goes today. And I think that, you know, people, you worry. I worry about my young adult daughters, what's their world going to look like. And I think all this insecurity makes people to want to go backwards and sort of come back to some kind of image of the 50s or 60s that we had. But for God's sake, with an iPhone in one hand and eating avocado and mango, etc. But just bring us back there. And I think that is a little bit the conundrum we are in now. And it sort of speaks to people's feelings rather than to their intellect.
Can you hear me well? Well, first of all, thank you for the Wouters Center for having us. And before addressing the question, for us in Mexico, Missouri is a great example of how free trade is successful, how free trade works, how NAFTA works. Since NAFTA was enacted, trade with Mexico from Missouri, export from Missouri to Mexico has grown more than 500%. Mexico is the second largest market for Missouri exporters. It's the #1 market for crops and food. So that is a really, really good example how free trade works. And more than actually 100,000 jobs on Missouri depend on trade with Mexico. So this is just an example of how free trade needs to be seen as a good thing, because it's not only exports to Mexico, it's also Mexican companies investing here. There are around 2,000 jobs in Missouri that depends on Mexican companies. You have Gruma, you have Cemex, you have Bimbo here. Sara Lee, as you know, the brand is owned by a Mexican company that has operations here in Missouri. So that is a good example of how Missouri has been really, really successful in terms of trade, and in Mexico especially. And coming back to your question and following on the same order of ideas, I think people are always scared of change, basically, right? Of things that they don't know. And free trade is basically change. Free trade challenges you to become more competitive, to be out of your comfort zone, to become a better company, a better professional. And I think it's natural for a lot of people that to feel scared or to see the word of free trade in a bad way, because that means change on their professional lives, on their regular lives, et cetera, et cetera. We need to take care of people also to become a more competitive professional globally. And that's basically what I think they see free trade. You know?
Well, Martin, you mentioned NAFTA, so I have to ask about that because it has certainly been in the headlines lately, but many of us probably are not following the latest as closely as you are. So is NAFTA officially dead? What can you speak to as far as this new agreement between just the U.S. and Mexico, and what does that mean for Canada?
Sure.
And Missouri, of course.
Sure. Well, as my job is basically to promote trade and investment between our countries. So you can imagine how interesting my job has become in the last 18 months, right? Well, I would say exciting, right? Exciting because every new day I'm learning things that I didn't know on business or on trade. Something that on my career, that is all the things that I learn about that. I'm learning new stuff every day. Every hour, actually. With every tweet, I'm learning new stuff. But, so actually there is no formal trade right now. We are drafting the fine print as we speak. What we had basically was an agreement on an agreement, how to solve key issues that were not damaging, but issues that need to be addressed in order to improve the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship. NAFTA is a trade agreement that has been in place 25 years, so it needs to be modernized. Back when NAFTA was enacted, we didn't have e-commerce. For example, we didn't have Amazon, we didn't have eBay. The energy sector in Mexico was closed. Infrastructure in Mexico was not as big as it is today, the middle class, for example. So there is a need to modernize NAFTA. NAFTA is still there because we are still waiting for Canada, if Canada wants to join. But the most complex issues on these negotiations were between Mexico and the US, basically, especially in the automotive sector. So we managed to overcome that, but we are still waiting for Canada if they want to join. But Mexico has always insisted that the name of the game is to have the three countries together, because if we want to become competitive, we have to compete as a region, not as an individual country. So we always will try to push to have Canada in the agreement as well.
All right. Now, Caroline, you mentioned the free flow of trade in the members of the EU. Can you speak to what increased barriers could mean, whether within the European Union or with trading partners around the world? How does that impact investment, and how might we see that on a more local level?
Yeah, that is something that we hope we will not see more of. Within the European Union, we have decided that there should be no barriers, and we are working constantly on removing those barriers. For example, now there's a new legislation coming out on, you were talking about e-trade, for example, that when you should be able to buy things over the internet within the European Union, and you should not, for example, be what they call geo-blocked, which means that if you live in a certain part of the European Union, you cannot buy stuff, you won't see the prices and can't buy stuff from other parts. That they are taking away, trying to improve the flow of packages, etc. So if I want to buy, a bathing suit from Spain sitting in Sweden, well, I can order it over the internet and it comes to me, and the whole market is open to me. Talking about obstacles, we see already the result of obstacles coming up. The steel and aluminum tariffs that the US has now imposed on not only on the European Union, but a number of other countries, Mexico as well. You have now seen, since I got the last statistics now for that, there has been a 25% jump in exclusion requests from mid-July to now. Since this was introduced in the middle of March, there has been 29,000 requests on exemptions for steel, 3,500 requests for exemptions on aluminium. It concerns 753 companies. Mm-hmm. And if anybody of you have filled out one of these forms, you know you don't know it if you don't need it. There is a timeline that's supposed to be 90 days for getting an exemption or not getting an exemption. They're not able to cope with that. So you have numerous companies that are sitting needing really specialized type of steel from somewhere in the world, and they can't get it, and they don't know when they are going to get it, and they don't know if they are going to get it at all. And if you think that is something that promotes trade, or promotes even market economy, or promotes good business practice, or that is not what it is to me. So these are the artificial obstacles that are put up with these tariffs, for example. Then there are other tariffs that there are no exemptions from. And all those who are depending, for example, now on deliveries from China for parts of their own manufacturing or what they are doing, well, they will get price increases, because who is buying? When you put on extra tariffs, who is paying? It's not the seller, it's the buyer is paying. So this is a tax on American companies, although nobody is illustrating it like that. I would say also another result of barriers coming up like that, it is that protectionism, exactly as we just heard, protectionism is decreasing the competitiveness of companies, because you are not forced to innovate. You can exist in a sheltered world, and you lose in competitiveness with the world outside. You have the Jones Act in the United States that is protecting your merchant fleet. That's why it's more expensive to send a ton of goods to Hawaii than to send a ton of goods from California to China. Because it's a protected market. There's no competition in the US merchant fleet. And this is what's happening.
Ambassador Wouters, we've certainly seen some back and forth between the U.S. and the EU, and some more back and forth between the U.S. and China, with more tariffs and more talk of different sectors of trade that will be affected. So this might be kind of crystal balling it, and if Carolyn and Martine have anything to add, please do. But where do you see this ending, and what do you see as the ultimate impact globally of what we've been experiencing these last couple of years?
Thank you. I hope we will not end in a situation where tariff becomes an active verb. But it is probably, as we speak, I guess it's rather difficult to see what the end game is in this trade war between China and the United States. Why is that? Because there is not enough information available, I think, on the kind of policy measures that China might be considering in order to satisfy, let's say, the American requests. So, and on the other hand, I don't think that the Chinese have told their American interlocutors what in the chain of pain for them, with the kind of economy they have, which is not a market economy, quite frankly, what they could consider as a concession in order to go back to a better situation. And so we, on both sides, I think some information and clarity is still missing. But what we can say today is that the issues with China are not new. I mean, the Chinese economy is not as transparent as it should be for a quote-unquote market economy. There are still so many issues on intellectual property. There are still issues on the question of currency manipulation, although it has been improved, I think, the dialogue with the United States on that in the past. But the issues are still out there, and I think the real measure of success in the relationship between these two big economies is whether the Chinese economy can become more transparent when the Chinese economy, well, there are less issues on intellectual property, there are less issues on the transfer of technology, That's the measure, I think, of progress. And these are kind of systemic issues on which, in Europe, we would agree that there are systemic issues which have to be seriously addressed. But maybe our prescription is slightly different. I think we would like to see that we move from the present landscape in the world on trade, where you had probably some progress in the Mexico-US front. You have a truce between the temporary but fragile truce between the United States and the European Union. But we have to move to a much better situation with the United States, with Mexico, Canada, so that we can hold together and hopefully, again under the leadership, as in the past of the United States, address these systematic issues. But I don't think that tariffs will solve the issue. I mean, I still remember, I conclude, I think it was President Clinton, if I may, who once said that globalization is like the forces of nature, wind, water. And then he was going on in 2001 when China was becoming a member of the World Trade Organization. He was very much in favor with the argument that we would pin down, the rest of the world would pin down China on the lower tariffs of the organization of which China would become a member. And so the idea was that then the deficit of the United States, the trade deficit with China, could improve. Now, since 2001, unfortunately, the deficit with China has leapt to fivefold. So, well, it's not only economists that can be wrong in predicting the future. Usually they often are, but one can make a mistake in predicting. But I don't think that if the goal of China, among others, is to get access to Western technology, that imposition of tariffs, which will most probably affect intermediate goods that are traded within global companies, that this will solve the problem of the trade deficit of the United States. So we have to look at the more systematic things, so that we have for the business community of the United States working in China and working with China, better respect of what a market economy should be. And we have to move to a better place also, because if we don't move to a better place compared to the one we have, with still risk of more tariffs on, I don't know, on cars, and we still have the steel and aluminum, I think the work you're all doing in the business community with the rest of the world may become more difficult in the future, because once you have tariffs, well, they're there, but very difficult to roll them back and to come back to a situation where probably it was a bit easier to do international and free trade. Thank you.
Martin, all this talk about the trade deficit, part of what has been apparently driving the talk of tariffs has been that reducing the trade deficit. We hear the president often say that other countries are taking advantage of the United States, and particularly China and Mexico. Can you address that a little bit and give your perspective on what that all means?
Thank you for giving the opportunity to share our thoughts about the trade deficit, because we don't usually have the platforms to really explain what trade deficit means, and especially when most of the administration policies towards trade are focused on reducing the trade deficit. And I will try to explain it really, really simple. So Mexico is 110 million people, more or less. It has an economy that is 15 times smaller than the US. But even though Mexico manages to buy twice as much per capita from the US than the US buys from Mexico. So that means in Mexico, per person, we buy around $2,000 worth of American goods per person. And in the US, you buy almost $1,000 per person of Mexican goods. So if you want to fix the trade deficit, you need really need to focus on larger economies or even larger countries. Because if you want to fix the trade deficit, in this case with Mexico, each Mexican people will need to buy even 4 times what you are buying right now, with an economy that is 15 times smaller. And even with those numbers in mind, Mexico is the second largest buyer of US goods in the world, and it's going to become #1 on the next 5 years. So it's really hard to just fix the trade deficit just by the sense of fixing it, because you need to follow the economics behind that. And I'm going to give you more examples of that. Mexico is around, of the whole total trade of the US, Mexico is 9% of the total deficit. But if you take into account only Mexico and the US trade relationship, Mexico sells 12% more of Mexican goods to the US than the US, and vice versa. But so there is a trade deficit. But if you compare that with countries such as Korea, Korea is only 4% of the total trade deficit. But if you take only Korean and US trade, Korea sells 25% more to you guys. Or if you take Germany, because you're buying a lot of luxury cars from Germany. So Germany is like Mexico. It's like 9–10% of the total trade deficit. But Germany is selling 45% more to you than you are selling to Germany. So that's the kind of trade deal that you need to focus on, more developed economies. Or for example, if you take China, that you were talking about China, China is 50% of the trade deficit that the US has. But if you take in consideration only China and the US, China sells almost 70% more to the US than the US to China. So yes, there are trade deficits. Yes, there is a trade deficit in Mexico, but as you can see, it's way different from the rest of the countries. And I'm going to explain you even further. Why is this different? For every dollar that Mexico exports to the world, almost half of that dollar is American content. So that means, now that we're talking about Germany, and I was talking to the honorary consul around here, BMW is building a brand new plant in the center of Mexico. So over there, they're going to produce the BMW 3 Series, that is a small BMW. That's going to be a global platform. That means BMW is going to export through Mexico to 123 countries around the world that vehicle. So every single vehicle that BMW makes in Mexico and is going to be sent back to the US, to Brazil, to Europe, the Middle East, is going to be made in the US. Because the more we export from Mexico, the more you export to the world as well. That's why trade deficit is not precisely as how you read it on the news, because again, we make things together. And that's how we have to see it as an overall.
All right, before we run out of time, and I have a million more questions, but I want to end by asking each of you to think about some advice that you could give to the folks here in the room. We have about 700 people here who clearly are interested or involved with the globalization of our world and bringing it closer to home. Act local, think global. So let's start with Caroline. What can you tell either our business people, our elected and civic leaders here in the room? What advice do you have on what they could do to influence trade policy at a national level and make their voice heard that would be impactful?
Well, I think we are we have a perfect timing here. There are elections coming up in a few months, and you here, if you see what you pay in new tariffs because of what has been introduced by this administration, Missourian companies pay $1 billion extra after the new tariffs per year. That's the calculation that the American Chamber of Commerce has made. So I'm not, what you got from the administration when it comes to the tax reform, which I believe was very much welcome from everybody who are in business, that is going to be eaten up by the tariffs. I think this is a city born on trade, because your founder actually came here to create a trade imperium with France and Europe to sell fur and to bring in European products. So you are a city based on trade. And I think you should ask, before you go voting, you should ask your candidates, what is your position on trade? Are you aware of this? You need to speak for us in Washington and vote for the person who stands up for free trade, because I think that is fundamental for a city and for a state that actually tries and is truly global. So I would like, it doesn't have anything to do with European Union. It's a question of saving the international trade system we have. There's a grave threat against the WTO, which is sort of providing the traffic rules for international trade. It might not function optimally. You know, we all come to crossings that we don't understand. Why is there a four-way stop here? It shouldn't be. But it's the best we have. And as Ambassador Wouters said, if we let this break down, it will be almost impossible to build it up again. And the US is a very, very strong economic actor. It's a very strong political actor. But when you are a giant, you have to be a gentle giant. You cannot step on things that you cannot put together again. So I would say, use your vote, and also those who will stay, because there are others who will remain. Request from them to stand up for free trade.
Ambassador Wouters, any thoughts?
Yes, but normally I'm very cautious in giving advice to a strong and a powerful community as this in St. Louis. But if I may, I think it is important that to continue to highlight that a lot of your relationships and the relationships of the United States with its allies are, in the first place, investment relationships, and that creating jobs in respective places of the where the companies are established, and that the trade, a lot of the trade, if not most of the trade, takes place between the companies that have invested on both sides. And I think one has to continue to highlight this. And second, well, there are, of course, sometimes interesting practices. Last week I was with a Belgian global company in the chemical sector, and they had their annual meeting, not as big as this one, of course, but and they looked a bit exhausted and said, what happened to you? Yes, we brought all our North American people today to Washington, and as part of their training, they had 226 conversations with staffers on the Hill. I was really impressed, because they had to explain what the company was doing, that they were already, because they're a global company working in China, US, and Europe, they were already paying twice tariffs, because often the business model is one of, I take something I import from one country, add value in another, and re-export it to the, so that is useful. And if I may conclude on the young people. I mean, when I was young, and even at school or at university, we had more or less a good idea of what advantages were of free trade. And one could say exactly the same of agriculture. I mean, we had an idea that, okay, it feeds people and it landscapes nicely the country, agriculture, and so it performs positive functions. But today, I'm not sure that, well, at least not in my country, but I guess in many other countries, that the young people know some of the really advantages of free trade or of agriculture. And maybe, well, maybe that the strong leaders that I see before me can also do their part in trying to educate a bit the young people on the things that matter for the future in this global world. Thank you.
All right, last word, Martin. Any advice for our audience?
Well, more than an advice is a thought that North America as an economic bloc, it's in a unique position of economic leadership to compete against other blocs in the world. Why? And why NAFTA works is because we have been able to allocate our resources in a more efficient and competitive way. We have infrastructure, we have energy, we have skilled labor, competitive labor. We have R&D. So as I was saying, the name of the game is to compete as a bloc. And I think we need to work towards that to strengthen our position as a bloc, because in order to be successful in the upcoming years, we need to be together to, again, allocate our resources more efficiently and to work diligently as a NAFTA bloc. Because if we try to compete as an individual nations, or a range of competitiveness will decrease. And that's why NAFTA has been really setting an example around the world. And in that regards, Mexico is still committed and will be committed to defend these free trade policies, not only with NAFTA, also with the European Union. We just re-signed the modernization of our agreement. So that's my final thought, because at least in Mexico, NAFTA was more than a free trade agreement, not paying duties treaty. It was a tool that allowed Mexico to become a most modern economy, a more prosperous country, a rising middle class that is actually buying more American products because of the middle class. So again, myself, I'm a byproduct of NAFTA because I was working in a port. So that's what free trade brings to countries and to communities. And I think as a final thought is that we have to commit to that idea.
Martín Caro, Caroline Vicini, and Dirk Wouters, thank you so much for your time today, and we appreciate your thoughts and your words. Can you give a round of applause to our esteemed panel?